King Philip's War had been an ethnically mixed conflict, okay, despite what many textbooks might tell you. After the Pequot War, there were decades where there was no open war between the natives of New England and colonists and their native allies. But by the mid-1670s, the region was a powder keg once again. Tensions had built up once again. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We might point to the fact that the Christianization / Anglicization of the native inhabitants in the region were well underway by the mid-1670s. Quite a few praying towns had been established by then, including some new ones. Something like a quarter of all the region's native inhabitants had by the mid-1670s either converted to Christianity or they were in the process of converting to Christianity. And of course there are other natives who deplore this transition and actively oppose Christianity and missionary efforts in general, not to mention the so-called praying Indians who had embraced it. All the while, of course, more and more Europeans are showing up, settling along New England's eastern and southern coasts, spreading inland, and from a native point of view, they seem to have an unquenchable desire for land. Of course, from a colonist point of view, the natives sure took up a lot of land per person, but from the native point of view, these guys have a very different concept of what it means to own land. Not to say that the natives didn't have conception of what land ownership was. They had their own conception of what it meant to own land. Natives would fight other natives over control over land, but their conception of land ownership tended to be, especially in this region, tended to be communal as opposed to individual. Europeans would come over here and they virtually always bought their land. It's a myth that they came over here, particularly during this early stage, and just stole all the land. They bought virtually all their land. But there were misunderstandings, cultural misunderstandings, as to what that meant. From a native point of view, that often meant, in a communal fashion, we've opened the land up for sharing. Then the colonists would come and actually build a house, a farm on the land, a fixed site that was theirs. And sometimes they'd throw up fences around the site and around their fields and their houses. Very, very different concept. Individual, exclusive ownership. That was somewhat foreign to the natives. And so tension builds over misunderstanding there. And for example, the Narragansett sold away virtually all of their land. Now, if you think about it, it's doubtful that they would have actually sold it had they known they were getting rid of it all, that they were selling it all. Clearly, they didn't mean to do that. And of course, later they'll come back and say, we didn't sell all their land, we didn't. But the colonists had the paperwork. In their point of view, the Narragansetts had sold their land. They had been paid for it. It had all been worked out. So you can see how these things are going to create tension. It's going to boil over at some point. Not only that, the colonists didn't even have to buy the land. Even if they were just in possession of land adjacent to native land, often their livestock would wander onto native land and trample hunting grounds and other things. So tension is building in that respect. But there was more. The fur trade was in decline. And of course, by saying the fur trade was in decline, I'm not saying it was in decline everywhere, the greater fur trade. The fur trade is going to be a thing, a major part of the economy deep into the 19th century on the continent. But here in this region, for decades, there's been overhunting. Why? Because the natives have come to depend upon European goods. Knives, hatchets, pots, cloth, textiles, alcohol, muskets. You name it. All sorts of things that the Europeans are producing that the natives buy from them, or they trade for, using furs. Furs, the way that they procure these things, these items. And with the fur stock down, they're less able to trade. And so some of them go into debt. And we see the creation of something like an American Indian debtor class because they can no longer trade furs for these items. And it's not just, poor American Indians. The son of the chief, Massasoit, the son of the Pokanoket chief, Massasoit, his son was named Metacom. And he had an English name, Philip, He had an English name, that tells you something. He was very often in Boston, Metacom. He was purchasing clothes, and he would apparently rack up quite the debt. And maybe the worst of it was that the American Indians living within what colonial authorities considered their territorial jurisdiction were subjected to colonial law, the colonial justice system. Okay, so even when a dispute was between two American Indians, they'd be dragged before an English-style court, and their dispute would be adjudicated there. And, you know, if they, one or the other, happened to not like what the English judge decided, of course, they're going to blame and resent the English. And that meant, you know, if you're subject to the English courts, the colonial court system, the justice system, that means you're subject to their law. So that would include things like, you know, blasphemy laws. American Indians in that jurisdiction are subject to colonial anti-blasphemy laws. And blasphemy carried the death penalty, by the way. Or, you know, labor on the Sabbath. This is anti-labor on the Sabbath laws. The American Indians would be subjected to those. And so often, you know, when someone commits a crime or allegedly commits a crime, the judge finds that they've committed a crime, often those people would be punished via a fine, or if they didn't have money to pay, confiscation of property. Well, most American Indians do not have money to pay, and so often allegedly guilty members of a group would be punished by having some of that group's land confiscated. So there's some more salt in that wound. And once again, it didn't matter who you were. The son of Massasoit, Wamsutta. This is the another son of Massasoit. So this is the son of the chief. This is actually the intended successor of Massasoit, Wamsutta is. He was dragged before an English-style court on charges of intent to commit mischief. And he had to humiliatingly defend himself, you know, on those charges. And the worst part was, he never lived to see freedom. While in colonial custody, he died. This is the successor to Massasoit, chief of the Pokanoket. And he dies in the custody of these Plymouth authorities. His brother, Metacom, who we've already introduced, he also was dragged before one of these courts, same charge, and even though he was later found innocent, and that's important too, Metacom was actually found innocent of these charges, still his firearms were confiscated, and the firearms of 100 more of his people were also confiscated. Meanwhile, traditional animosities between native groups also adding to the tension in the region. I mean, in a major way. Often it's overlooked. It's much cleaner and easier to understand a conflict between all of one group and all of another group, but nothing is that easy in colonial history, in history in general really, but in colonial history for sure. You have traditional animosities playing a major role as well. Far to the west, you have the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, who are expanding aggressively and violently. And their expansion, you know, has a ripple effect. It ripples through the various native societies in New England all the way to the coast. So that adds to the tension. You also have groups like the Mohegans who are allied with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They're under the protection of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They're feeling a little indomitable. They're feeling a little impervious to pushback as a result of that protection. And so they're on the warpath, and they have been raiding and murdering their traditional enemies seemingly at will. And they've even killed the chief of the Narragansett. And of course, by the 1670s, the disease-smitten native peoples have been reduced in population to about 10,000. Compare that to the 80,000 or so English, the 80,000 or so colonists. So it's 8-1 that the natives are outnumbered here in New England. It's not, we're not talking about the whole continent, obviously, but here in New England, the natives are outnumbered 8-1. So if there's going to be a native action against the colonists, if there's sentiment based on all this tension that's been combining, if there's sentiment among the natives to push the English out, this is the time, this is the only time, if it's not too late already. Well, with all this going on, the atmosphere was quite tense, and it seemed as though a simple spark could cause it all to combust. And the question is, what would the spark be? Well, in 1674, Metacom was once again called to appear before a Plymouth court. He'd been accused of being part of a conspiracy to attack the colony. See, a praying Indian and Harvard graduate, actually, named John Sassamon, claimed that the Wampanoags, at least a remnant of Wampanoags, the old Wampanoag Confederacy, the Pokanoket were the most powerful of the Wampanoags. And Wampanoag remnants were taking refuge at Mount Hope, one of whom was Metacom being among them. And apparently, according to John Sassamon, there was a conspiracy there to attack the colony. Metacom was involved. So that's the accusation. Well, Metacom shows up of his own free will, actually. He appears and he defends himself, and no solid evidence is given. And so the court releases him with a warning. Okay, and that could have been it. Except that shortly thereafter, John Sassamon, the accuser, was ambushed and murdered. And his body slipped under that lake right there. Or as they say here in New England, that pond. Assawamsett Pond. Frozen in winter, so you could slip the body under the ice. And that's what they did. That's the water I've been standing in front of throughout this mini lecture. So they slip his body under this lake, under this pond. But when you're using ice to hide the body, of course that's only going to work until spring, when the ice thaws and melts. And that's what happens. Spring comes along, the ice melts, and the body, the remains of John Sassamon, are revealed, are found. And so there's a search for the killers. And 3 Wampanoags were brought to court. One of them, by the way, an esteemed counselor of Metacom. So these 3 Wampanoags brought to court. The jury is a mixed jury, some Europeans, some American Indian elders. Okay, so it's a mixed jury. And the chief witness against these 3, eyewitness, was herself an American Indian. And based on her testimony, these 3 were convicted and executed by hanging. That was in June 1675. And that was the spark. Well, retaliation was swift. June 20th, the village of Swansea was attacked. Actually attacked multiple times. The first few times, the buildings were set on fire. But by the end, the inhabitants were being massacred. And that wasn't it. It wasn't just Swansea. King Philip himself, Metacom, led attacks and raids against 3 Plymouth settlements, while allied groups allied to Metacom, attacked 2 Massachusetts Bay settlements. And when colonial authorities tried to organize a small army, and they did organize a small army, sent it out hoping for a peace parley with these guys, Metacom and his forces ambushed this small army and destroyed it. So for anyone hoping that this thing would wind down quickly, it was clear now that that would not happen. In fact, even in Connecticut, sort of far away, towns, settlements are being abandoned. People are fleeing the backcountry towns because they're afraid they might be next. The seemingly defunct New England Confederation now roared back to life, and on September 9th declared war on the native groups responsible for the attacks and initiated a conscription effort. The goal was to raise a 1,000-man army. They want a military response to all this, a very strong one. And a lot of the colonies took this very seriously. In Connecticut, authorities forbade emigration. They didn't want people leaving, because if they leave, they can't be conscripted. Meanwhile, in Massachusetts Bay, the death penalty was imposed on those who refused to fight. And of course, all the while, the raids keep going, keep happening. When authorities tried to organize wagon trains to go out to the now abandoned fields and farms to get what they could of the harvest, those wagon trains were attacked and scores more colonists were killed. The largest settlement on the Connecticut River, Springfield, was virtually all burned to the ground. But as yet, the most powerful of the native groups in the region, the Narragansett, had not entered the conflict. There's nothing, no evidence linking them to Metacom's movement. There's nothing particularly suggesting that they will enter the conflict, but there's no doubt that if there's a native group that can turn the tide or that has the potential to be a threat to the Confederation, it's the Narragansett. And so negotiations ensue between the Narragansett and the Confederation, and the Narragansett promise not to join Metacom's movement and not to harbor any Wampanoag. See, that's important. They promised not to harbor any Wampanoag. They kept their word in terms of not joining Metacom's movement, but they did end up harboring some Wampanoag refugees, including some of Metacom's fighters. Okay, so when colonial authorities found out about that, they were livid. They demanded that these fighters be handed over. Of course, the Narragansett say no. They refuse. And so the New England Confederation raised another 1,000-man army and invaded Narragansett territory, which happens to be some of the best land in New England. It should be pointed out that a lot of New Englanders protested all this. Rhode Island in particular, non-Confederation Rhode Island, protested what the Confederation was doing, the Confederation invasion of Narragansett land. And the Confederation invaded Rhode Island too. So the whole conflict now took on a pan-New England character as the Confederation Army advanced. And I should point out that the Confederation Army was actually a coalition army. It included about 150 Pequots and Mohegans. So a Confederation coalition army advances into Narragansett territory, and as the army moves, Narragansett villages empty. These guys are fleeing in the face of this oncoming army, and they gather here. This used to be, at the time, a big frozen swamp, whereas I'm here in the early fall, so it's not so frozen right now, but at the time this was a big frozen swamp, and they gathered right here at this site where I'm standing. They built a fort right here and gathered inside it. And of course, because they're gathering from villages, their numbers include many women and children. So they're gathered here when the Confederation forces arrive, and a huge fight ensues. This fight is known as the Great Swamp Fight. The Great Swamp Fight. In fact, there's a marker here, sort of in the middle of nowhere, not really oft visited, I think mostly forgotten. I passed one other person on the way here, and she has a master's in history. Both she and I, by the way, had at least one ancestor who was here, who fought in this war, and was here for this battle. The Great Swamp Fight. Well, some 500 Narragansett are killed here at this site. About 70 coalition militia and warriors are killed here as well, but about 500 Narragansett perish here. About half of that number, women and children. And the fort is burned down, and the Narragansett winter supply is destroyed. And the Great Swamp Fight really does break the back of the Narragansett. Never again will they pose a massive collective threat to the colonies. Okay, so their power is broken, even though for a little while, temporarily, scattered bands of Narragansett continue to wreak havoc on Rhode Island settlements. Well, once the Narragansett had been broken, once their power had been neutralized, they had been pacified as a people, pacified, all resources could be thrown at Metacom, and they were. You know, he's now a hunted man. Still, his band of followers continues to raid throughout the winter and spring of 1676. They're still raiding, colonial farms and whatnot. The problem with fighting guerrilla style, though, is that, for that style of warfare to work, you sort of need the support of a large portion of the rural population, of the food-producing population. That's how that style works. And when you're dependent on raiding enemy farms, that's it, you're going to run low on supplies. That's just going to happen. And that is what happens. And as they run low on supplies, Metacom's men, one by one, begin to abandon him and leave, until eventually he's betrayed by one of those men, and he is shot and killed by a praying Indian named John Alderman. In fact, he's shot and killed right here. I'm at the Miry Swamp in Rhode Island. This is home to Metacom's chair, King Philip's chair, his throne, so-called. This was sort of a base of operations for them. He was killed right here, and his wife and child enslaved and shipped off to Bermuda, and his head, detached from his body, was displayed for the next quarter century on a pike in Plymouth. King Philip's War had been an ethnically mixed conflict. Okay, despite what many textbooks might tell you, sort of portraying it as colonists versus Indians, very black and white, when you look into it, it's a lot muddier than that. Various American Indian groups, not to mention the colonists' own praying Indians, these are members of the colony itself, but American Indians, fought with the colonists, with the Confederation, against the Wampanoag and the Narragansett. Meanwhile, you have many colonists, particularly here in Rhode Island, and especially among the Quakers here in Rhode Island, and missionaries too throughout the colonies, who vociferously opposed the war, protested it, refused to fight, gave aid to the belligerent American Indians, and refused aid to Confederation soldiers. Again, it gets very muddy very fast. But the iteration of New England society that had existed before King Philip's War, one in which American Indians were very much present and a part of it, and that really was destroyed by the conflict, replaced by a much more ethnically homogeneous society. There's no question. We have a hard time even picturing what it was like before. That paradigm is gone. And so our paradigm of what it was like is now reflected, I think, in most textbooks, but incorrectly. That iteration of New England society before the war was different. It's something we have a very hard time imagining, but it was real. And after King Philip's War, it was destroyed. Most of the natives here had been killed by disease, and then King Philip's War pushed most of the rest away or killed them. And when it comes to the belligerents and prisoners of war, these guys were shipped off as slaves to the Caribbean, where most of them probably died quickly. As for the Confederation, very, very costly conflict. 1,000 colonial fighting men had perished. 20 colonial towns lay in total ruin, and many more partially damaged. Not to mention the huge debts racked up by belligerent governments, the colonial governments, in order to prosecute the war. But despite these massive losses, the Confederation had won. Never again would native peoples around here in this region, New England, pose an existential threat to European settlers here. In terms of ratio of the population, King Philip's War was the bloodiest war in colonial American history, and arguably in all of American history.